and welcome to episode, I think, 43. It's been a long time since I recorded a pod, and actually, the last time I recorded a pod was with Jane Gatsby, and here we are again. She's she's the host of the Wonderland podcast. My notes here say she's a student of complexity, philosophy, liberty. There's lots that's happened since we last caught up, and for those people listening now saying, "What the fuck are you talking about?" We did record a podcast. What was it now? 4 weeks ago. But the internet was so shit that we had to dunk it. So here we are, round two.
Round two. Let's get into
round two. Indeed. So we're going to cover like a whole lot of stuff. Let's start with setting some like foundational stuff. So yeah, if you can sort of give the listeners a little bit of, I don't know, should we start with a foundation on, what is philosophy, epistemology, metaphysics, and maybe some complexity theory? Let's sort of create a bedrock and then we'll start digging. What's the meaning of life, Jane? Tell us now.
Okay, so a philosophy I would define as being the study of three different distinct domains. Philosophy is the study of the fundamental nature of existence, of reality, of ourselves, and then our relationship to existence. And so that breaks down into the domains of metaphysics, which is concerned with the fundamental nature of reality, epistemology, which is how we can come to acquire information about reality, and then morality, which is the question of what you should do given the information you're able to acquire.
Mm-hmm. And I guess why does that matter? And who needs it?
I think it matters because everybody is operating by some sort of philosophy, whether implicitly or explicitly, that's going to be motivating how you interpret things in the world and how you act in the world. And if you don't have a philosophical system that's kind of thought through and integrated, then you're going to probably be encountering a lot of kind of uncertainty or contradiction in your own behavior that's going to be generating a lot of guilt and shame concerning things like if you're not operating by a consistent set of principles in your life that you can kind of describe and refer back to that's motivating your choices throughout the world, then you're just kind of acting arbitrarily and aimlessly. And so even if people don't normally think of philosophy as being something that has a lot of impact on their day-to-day life, they're always going to be operating by some philosophical system, but it might just be happening implicitly, and they're not going to be cognizant of the sorts of impacts that it's having on their life.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And do you think that's sort of almost reminiscent in modern society or modern culture, in a sense that like things like philosophy, and I don't know if we discussed this last time, but kind of the study of matter, like sort of empirical sciences and studies have kind of taken precedence over the study of what matters. So like, philosophy and economics and trade-offs and psychology, and like sort of we've tried to then take the study of what matters and almost deconstruct it and place it into these, formulaic boxes and try and squeeze it into these models, which don't actually reflect reality. And then all of a sudden these, things like philosophy become empty in a sense. Like, do you think that's sort of reminiscent of today?
Yeah, I definitely think that with the, enlightenment and the obvious success that science has brought us and the scientific method, there's been a surge in the past 100 years or so to start taking those same techniques and applying them to the domains of like the social world and the spiritual world. And I think that's to their own detriment. I think science works really well for like hard science categories, but as soon as you start trying to expand that into the humanities and then using scientific methodologies to derive meaningful information about how you should live your life, I think that's going in the wrong direction, and it's going to produce a lot more contradiction and confusement than the other way around. Confusion.
Confusement. I like that.
New word.
Yeah, look, I couldn't agree more. I did the recent piece that I did, like sort of the chapter 2 of my 12 rules for Bitcoin, like looking at it through the Jordan Peterson lens, was like had a whole section about the study of matter and what matters, and the fact that we've had such a positive feedback loop in the study of matter, in many ways we've kind of, I don't know, like de-evolved the other studies by trying to put them in there. And what's interesting is that, we need both. Like, maybe thousands of years ago, we didn't really have a methodological process for studying matter, and as such, we thought the rain came from fucking dancing around in a circle and praying to the nearest rock to make it rain, and that's not functional, right? So it's sort of, I think, a functional society, well, not I think, it's evident that a functional society requires both, and not the attempt to try and understand one without the other. But that leads me into complexity theory, which I think is a really interesting bridge, in a sense, between both.
Oh, that's very true.
Yeah, can you talk us through? Can you talk us through that?
Yeah, complexity theory is essentially the study of complex adaptive systems, which kind of span across lots of phenomena in the social sphere as well as in like the natural world. And so complexity is kind of emerging as like a meta science that can be really useful for examining phenomena that exist either in nature or in emergent social relations that we have. In terms of explaining what complexity theory is, I always struggle with it. It's not
Yeah.
anything that's, it's essentially you're describing a bunch of features or characteristics that govern a whole bunch of different sorts of systems, but they all have certain similarities. So complex adaptive systems are complex, meaning that they are entangled and interrelated. They are made out of a bunch of different agents that all will interact in ways that are nonlinear. So you can get things like feedback loops and snowball effects. And then they are adaptive, meaning that they are interacting, they're not self-contained, they're receiving information from and responding to in an environment, which is kind of spurring new changes and progress in the system. So like a classic example of a complex adaptive system would be like Darwin's theory of natural selection or something, evolution, where you've got certain mutations that are occurring, you've got some variants occurring in the system, and then if that is something that is beneficial in relation to the environment, then it'll be selected for and propagated into the future. But then so you could say something like social media is also an example of a complex adaptive system, but then you're going with different kinds of information that are, if you're talking about like, when memes go really viral or something, that's something that's being selected for in relation to a certain context of culture and comedy or whatever it is.
I mean, like the human body is another example, right? So as an economy, like I loved in one of your episodes, you sort of mentioned that, we're taught when we learn math and statistics and everything that, somehow the world has these, bell curve distributions, but in reality, most things distributed more like 80-20 or like Pareto law type distributions where, if we look at, how nature functions, or how things compound, when there's positive feedback loops, you get natural power law distributions, right? In life, and that sort of, that's completely natural, but people are sort of taught that somehow these these bell curve normal distributions are how we should sort of view the world. So can we pull a couple threads there perhaps?
Yeah, well, part of the problem is that we're taught that a bell curve is a normal distribution. It's the normal kind of makes you think that this is something that should be a default. Bell curves only apply to instances where the information is kind of unrelated to the other information that's being measured in the system. It's all like just independent one-off occurrences. So something like people's heights or weights or shoe sizes would all abide by bell curves. But once the agents in the system are interrelated, as if like somebody else's height could have an impact on your height, that's when you
Mhm.
start getting Pareto distributions. And that's happening because of that nonlinear component I mentioned earlier, where like say if you've got like in a market you're selling books or something like that, the moment a book starts creeping up on a bestseller list, it's going to accumulate more sales because it's going up and up on the bestseller list. And so you start seeing a snowballing effect where then suddenly you know, in basically any industry you can think of, yeah, 20% of the books will have 80% of the sales, 20% of the cities will have 80% of the population density, 20% of the stars in the galaxy also contain 80% of the density. Like
Mass.
it applies to
Yeah.
absolutely everything.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and it applies to wealth. Like wealth distribution is the
Mhm.
same thing. Like, you know, the more this is where I want to dig into this one later, but just sort of like how inequality is a predicate for complexity in a sense, like, or maybe the other way around, like, you know, inequality is a natural outcome of complex systems, and that's sort of what helps drive them. But just a quick note that I've got here is maybe defining the three components of a complex system. So the agents, drives, and signals. Maybe we can give an example so people can better contextualize this in their heads.
Yeah. So as you just said, they've got three components: agents, drives, and signals. Essentially, agents are motivated by certain drives or desires, and then they communicate information via signals that are being left behind in the system. So in an example like social media, if you're looking at like, yeah, some viral meme or something like that, then the users are the agents, the drive is entertaining content, and then the signal is being, however, if you're interacting with something online, then you're giving it a little data point that then is going to force it up or down in the algorithm. And so simple, like people just going online and like scrolling through TikTok is a perfect example or something. It's like TikTok's algorithms are completely based in complex adaptive systems. You just get an account and it just starts giving you random videos, and you don't have to do anything in terms of providing it an input in terms of what you want. It just starts giving you videos, and then depending on if you're liking it or commenting on it or sharing it or like watching the full thing or just scrolling past it, it uses all that information to then customize the content more towards what you want over time. And so you're going to get these really intelligent systems that are based off of no one person going in and kind of setting the bars of, well, this is going to be the desired outcome. That's how you get like the invisible hand of the markets or something too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's a really important point there. It's like the reason why I think, and you know, many libertarians and Australian economists and all that sort of stuff, I guess, understand that central planning can never actually win, is because it just can't compete against a complex system in which not only are decisions sort of pushed out to the edge, you know, which is seems to be how all of life functions, but also like another piece here that you mentioned in one of your pods is the how complex systems use random error to their advantage.
Mhm.
And I know you used the ant example of that. Do you want to talk it through a
Yeah,
little
sure.
bit?
And the notion of using sort of variance towards your advantage is, you know, like that's what Nassim Taleb calls anti-fragility. The systems
Mm-hmm.
get stronger under duress. So you could go with like, yeah, an ant, or evolution again, the notion of like, if an ant colony is kind of has its network operating and it's harvesting off of certain resources and all the ants are going their little predetermined pathways, the ants will more or less kind of abide by whatever their neighboring ants are doing, but they have a little bit of variance and randomness in their own behavior, where once in a while you'll get one dummy worker ant who just takes a completely random course. And generally speaking, you might think, oh, well, that's a really bad thing because he's not going and doing the harvesting like all of his brothers are. But what if he goes and wanders and finds a whole abandoned picnic or something? Then that little bit of random variation, just like a genetic mutation that can have adaptive advantages, suddenly that little ant has discovered a new food source, and then he can relay that information back to the colony. Where if all ants were stuck in like a constant state where there's no variance occurring, then eventually they would just deplete all the food resources and they'd all starve to death too. So what you're saying about central like planning as well, um, the problem is like even if you had someone who's a total genius who is like able to think about every single internal issue that might arise and plan everything perfectly, your central planning will never be able to keep up with the fact that there's an external environment which is also impacting how the system needs to be responding. um, yeah.
Yeah, I think I feel like that's one of the, I always use the example of when I learned stunt driving in my mid-20s. And one of the first lessons I was taught was when the car's losing control, you let go of the steering wheel. You let go of the steering wheel, you let go of the brake, you let go of everything. And I think, one of the beautiful things about life is it's, irrespective of how much we try and like fucking hold on to it and grasp it and control it, like, life proceeds whether we let go or whether we grasp onto it. And I feel like, human beings in our arrogance or in our attempt to, run things. I actually met someone recently who, within 24 hours, like drove me absolutely mental, like because like she was such a control freak about life, like uh, completely anxious about any form of uncertainty. And it's like, and this probably feeds into like stoicism and all of that. It's like the ability to let go and like let life proceed and find its way. I don't know, it seems to be like lacking in the world today. We try and over control everything. And we're sort of taught this fallacy of, if only we had enough resources, or if only we had enough, intelligence, if only the intellectuals had enough power, everything would be perfect. And
Mhm.
like perfection is this outcome, which first of all, it's a stupid outcome to attain, because it cannot exist, right? It's like perfection is a relative term anyway. But I think it's just such an important piece. I don't know if you got anything to add to that, but I kind of wanted to ask, like, maybe what some of your inspirations were on kind of coming to this sort of thinking, because it's obviously rare in the world.
In terms of complexity in particular.
Yeah, or just in terms of like the ingredients of like, you know, being a young woman, and like sort of having, I guess, almost the courage or the insight to be willing to adopt a position of, the world is more complex than that which I can, create and completely manage. Like I feel like that takes a lot of courage. I feel like most people are living in a constant state of fucking anxiety because everything has to be a particular way, and they seem to be the people who end up, I don't know, in government and politics and try and impose that shit on everybody else.
Well, in terms of like developing an interest in it, my mom teaches complexity. Like she's a university professor,
Oh
and
wow,
she
okay.
teaches it. And so that kind of gave me the tools of the understanding. And then Jordan Peterson also talks about kind of complexity a lot, rather indirectly. I don't know if he ever uses
Yeah.
that terminology, but he talks about chaos and order, and he talks about Pareto distributions and kind of people being in a constant process of negotiating with, um, how much do you want to pull relics from the past into the future, and how much you need to adapt and change, and all of that kind of abides by complex adaptive principles, which is why in my podcast I use complexity theory as the metaphysics, or what we were mentioning earlier. Like to me, it says something very fundamental about the basis of how reality operates and unfolds. And that's why I'm so interested in exploring it, and why I think it has such relevant implications on politics, is because there's something about complexity which is incredibly naturalistic, and kind of it's meta structure in terms of it doesn't have any prescriptive paths of like, this is how things need to be consistently done. It's about the rules and the relationships that are governing any particular manifestation. And those things can stay consistent over time, even if the way that they're currently appearing is diverse and always changing.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. That's such a good point, that will feed into later when we talk about like royalism and how, you know, new forms of society can actually function. I recall you mentioning something about, you know, when you go and buy an Apple product, for example, you don't care about the internal structure of how Apple functions as a business. You just want the fucking phone, right? So it's like, it's almost, I don't know, I feel like there's an analogy to it, but we'll dig into that in a moment. Determinism and free will. This was an interesting subject in one of your things. So let's talk through that.
Oh, where to start? I think brains are complex adaptive systems like anything else. That's a thing I mentioned in the podcast. Your brain is kind of abiding by the same principles that an ant colony is in terms of your neurons are just these little things that you don't think of as having much agency, but then they kind of compound in these interactions that can gain symbolic value as you increase in like the layers of stratification, and to the point where you get something that's doing things that are quite intelligent and manipulating symbols that aren't necessarily existing on the base substructures, where, you know, the ants are just little worker ants hanging out, but then they've all kind of got different castes. That means they've got certain jobs to do and stuff like that. And in terms of how the ant colony is operating, it's not concerned with the movements of any particular ant, but it kind of has this emergent whole that can behave really intelligently. So there's definitely a parallel there between how I think how our consciousness evolves as well. And that worldview doesn't lend itself to a whole lot of free will, because it implies that, you know, all of your experiences is just the product of a bunch of causes that happen to you outside of your control, and then your neurons firing in a certain way that also, even if it feels like, you know, I'm composing the sentence, whatever word I say subsequently is going to be, it's not really being selected for, it's just a consequence of a bunch of causes that came before me. So I guess fundamentally I'm a determinist, but then I have this idea that your beliefs about the world beget outcomes in life. And so if you walk through life acting as though you don't have any agency, there's a difference, I guess, between things being caused and you not having agency, where you can be a causal being, your actions can still be meaningful and important. And so if you're emphasizing a system that says, well, no, you don't have any agency actually, then you're never going to do anything that's that productive. But you can have a worldview of saying, well, no, I can make meaningful choices in the world. And then that becomes an input, going back to that idea of like all of your beliefs, right? If you're raised in a household where you're constantly being told how much agency you have, you're going to be capable of making more difficult decisions than if you're being exposed to the contrary belief.
Okay, so does that sort of imply that because it's a really tough one to disentangle, right? Because you've got like this blend of you know, an agent who believes they have free will, but that sort of belief system has had to, I guess, be influenced in some way by something beforehand. But in believing that they have free will, maybe what do they cause circumstances or, you know, events such that they their assumption or their illusion of free will can kind of manifest further and kind of like it reinforces itself in a sense?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think your life unfolds in accordance with your expectations. So, and what you are, yeah, whatever you kind of set yourself out for, like, oh, okay, if you're telling yourself that you're really depressed and you don't have any friends or something, then you're going to perpetuate that narrative further into your life. But if you can redirect your thought to go, well, actually, you know, things are more or less fine, and maybe when you're presented with a context where you're able to meet somebody new, you're going to be more prone to taking them up on that opportunity rather than kind of be like missing out on opportunities that are kind of presenting themselves at the outsets of your life because you are not thinking that those are things that are available to you. I'm framing this really badly. Like if you aren't ever bothered to go and look for a job, you're not going to find a job. If you just go and spend a few days handing out resumes, well, maybe you won't get a job, but it's better than if you haven't done anything at all. That sort of thing of like, if you want to increase your potential for success, you have to be approaching the world as in, yeah, of course I can do anything, and with as empowered an attitude as possible. It doesn't matter insofar as if it's true in terms of what outcomes it will generate for you, but that's giving you the best possible chance.
So would you agree that if I said, we, like, as potentially agents with free will, are part of the deterministic equation in a sense in that case?
Yeah.
Like, so I guess it's, in that sense, maybe it's not like one or the other. Like, maybe free will and what determinism are like a lot more closely intertwined than what they're sort of made. Like, they're not poles, perhaps they are.
Yeah, I
I don't know.
definitely don't
Like,
think they're contradictory ideas.
mm,
And the episode of the podcast where I talk about free will and determinism, I'm kind of comparing like the competing views between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, because they've had a few discussions about it. And one of the points that I bring up is that Jordan Peterson is always going on and on about the importance of individual responsibility, right? But that notion is based on the assumption that my actions have a direct impact on other people in the world around me, which is a deterministic premise. The idea that if I have a conversation with somebody and it has the capacity to dramatically alter their actions, that alter the course of their life, that alters the course of their friend's life, et cetera, you can have this whole like ripple effect, which relates back to complexity, of course. Um, if everybody was completely had total free will, then it shouldn't matter what somebody else does or says to you, because your actions are completely, self-driven and self-motivated. So it kind of, the notion of free will is kind of places you in isolation in relation to the rest of the world, because it's not something that you are a continual part and process of. Whereas I like the view that you are both something that is caused, but you have the capacity to cause as well. And so placing the focus more in your agency than the things that precipitated it, I think just produces better outcomes overall.
yeah, interesting. I I think that's such a, like, it's a huge rabbit hole to discuss. So I've got two more parts on this. Nature and nurture. Where do you sit on those two things?
I mean, it's got to be both, right?
Okay.
I don't know if there's much else I can say to that. Um, I think things are like, in terms of people's temperaments, I think we are, I don't know this for a fact, I'm fairly sure certain people are more kind of genetically predisposed towards certain outcomes than we like to generally think. But at the same time, it's kind of goes back to that same determinism point of like, well, there's no utility in emphasizing that. You're always going to increase your chances by going, okay, well, assume that that's not true, and let's focus more on the nurture aspect, because that's going to be where you have the ability to overcome obstacles if that's potential.
That's where you have the ability to at least influence, the outcome, right? Because you being an agent in the deterministic progression of things, right? Okay. Have you ever listened to anything like any of Alan Watts's stuff? The English philosopher. Okay. There's one thing that comes to mind from what he says, which I don't know if it relates to what we're talking about or not, but I'll chuck it in. He says that, people's decision making, and I'm going to completely, paraphrase and fuck this up, but it was something in the direction of people's decision making is something that occurs randomly. He goes, people just they want to make a decision and they can think about it, for like a moment, or they can think about it endlessly. But when the moment of decision comes, they kind of like, they just pick something anyway. So do you think that's in support of this idea of like determinism, or?
I don't know if it's something I entirely agree with. I feel like it's always so context dependent. I mean, it depends, right? If you're sitting in a restaurant, you're choosing between two dishes to order. you could say, and Sam Harris talks about this too, like, yeah, I don't really feel like I'm that in control of whatever menu item it is I ultimately select. Just kind of like, it could be a coin toss either way. Personally, I don't feel that way so much. If I'm choosing between two different dishes, it's like, okay, the one I order, I could tell you, oh, well, I decided that, I already had something with a little bit of dairy in it earlier today, so I went for the thing that doesn't have dairy, or whatever it is. Like, there's always going to be some little thing that's tipping the scale slightly in one direction or the other. But I guess maybe it varies on the person depending on how much you are self-aware of the things that are motivating your actions. It always kind of surprises me though when like Sam does this a lot when he frames things like, yeah, I'm just kind of doing things, but I don't feel like I have any agency. That seems very contradictory to my own experience.
Yeah, definitely. I would agree with that. Okay. Is there anything else you want to add there, or shall we dig into like the structure of freedom, liberty, politics, morality, and stuff?
Sure.
Yeah. Do you think there's any other bedrock that we need to set up though? Like, well, maybe let's start this with like how politics is downstream from morality. Let's maybe talk there first, because I think people they think that morality emerges from politics, which couldn't be further from the fucking truth. So maybe let's hit that first.
Yeah, I'm a first principles bottom up sort of thinker. So to me, the individual necessarily predates the collective in terms of where your own actions are stemming from. It doesn't really make sense to me to envision political institutions. Obviously, political institutions can have an impact on the behavior of individuals, but and if you're trying to kind of, from a philosophical standpoint, to figure out a political system, it has to be predicated in the psychology of the people that are going to be living inside of it. Because if there's some contradiction there, then the system is just going to fall apart. So to me, yeah, you always have to go from the bottom up and then not top down, because if you're kind of imposing things from a top down way, you might be unintentionally introducing contradictions into the system that you're not cognizant of. But if you go the opposite direction, that's not going to be an issue.
How is it not going to be an issue? Like, how do we avoid the contradictions going bottom up?
Because if you're looking at all of the agents in isolation and you're prescribing them a certain set of rules regulating their interactions, you're not going to have any sort of emergent entity that doesn't, what's the best way of saying this? I guess I just view everything in terms of this sort of critical realist framework of seeing reality in stratified layers. And so you can, going from the idea of like metaphysics to epistemology to ethics or something, you can kind of see a similar progression between the domains of mathematics to physics to chemistry to biology. You can't have a biological property that contradicts a fundamental principle of mathematics. Biology has all this additional interesting information occurring inside of it that isn't reducible to mathematics entirely, but you'll never have a biological system where 2 + 2 = 5. So if you're trying to top-down engineer political systems that then have are forcing its actors to behave by certain mechanisms, you might unintentionally kind of end up with a outcome where you're trying to force the agents to do something that's contradictory to their nature. So that's why I emphasize the nature of the agents first, and then you're trying to create an environment that makes it so that they can flourish as easily as possible.
Yeah, so top down can basically wind up in the 2 + 2 = 5 situation, right? Because it hasn't taken into account the foundation. Okay. You were going to mention something else before I kind of chuck something in there.
I don't know what I was going to mention.
Okay. Okay. All good. Another thing you talk about, so let's build on this structure of freedom piece. So you talk about the difference between rights and I don't know if you use the word entitlements or responsibilities. Can you talk through that a little bit?
You can't have one without the other. It's a simple equation. Relationship between rights and responsibilities. Yeah, I mean, essentially, people nowadays love to talk about human rights and the idea that every person has a right to, a roof over their head and good quality healthcare and education and all these amazing things. And I feel like sounds like such an old talking point now, but if you're not, it's weird that we've come to accept it so broadly without ever considering the corollary implication, which is that any rights that you're demanding of the world imposes obligation upon some other entity to be delivering those things to you. And so I like thinking of rights more so as a moral concept where
Mhm.
like people have a right to do whatever it is that they think is going to, produce a meaningful life for themselves. But it's not a right that's a political promise because nothing can be kind of guaranteed in any sort of political system. It's just a matter of empowering, like, yeah, you have a right to assert yourself essentially, but that's a moral principle. It's not a political one. But the idea that you should have a right to, yeah, certain luxuries, it just imposes upon some other aspect of the world to deliver those things to you. And then it begs the question of, well, how can you be saying that your desires are superior to somebody else's or whatever the case may be?
Yeah, I so fundamentally agree with this. Like, I kind of try to grapple with it when I wrote that Utopian Dystopias article, and I kind of tried to distill all rights down to like, and you kind of said it, the right to assert yourself. Like I called it the right to choose, right? And like, I think almost all rights can boil down to that. And then when you start to introduce, other players into the system, then you need some sort of framework in which your right to choose can remain sacrosanct without, I guess, without being a detriment to another's right to choose. And that's where things like the silver rule and stuff like that um, come into play. But yeah, like I couldn't agree more. Like I did a podcast with Alex Gladstein from the Human Rights Foundation. And I kind of like gave him shit about the whole human rights thing. It's like there's so many human rights today, but it's like there actually isn't any human rights. It's like it's you choose or you don't choose, like, which is a choice. But like it's that's the fundamental right of existence, I guess. And like you said, it's not something that is given to you by somebody. That's sort of a natural right of existence. You have the capacity to choose, and if you want to interact with others, it's possibly a good idea not to enslave them and remove their right to choose, should you wish to have some sort of social cohesion amongst other people.
Yeah, to secure any
So
rights yourself, you've got to sacrifice your ability to infringe the same rights of other people, and that way you've got a notion of equality that's going to be stable.
mhm. um, you also, in your episode about the was it called the structure of freedom or the structure of liberty? I can't remember.
Structure
Like
of freedom.
structure of freedom. Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Like goldfish memory. I think the salt's getting to me.
Well, there was something else called another political text called the Structure of Liberty, so I couldn't do that. But I mean, it's the same.
Same thing.
Yeah.
You talked about like the problem with majority rule, right? Which we sort of know as democracy, and I mean, everyone runs around and talks about how democracy is such an important thing, and democracy is what makes free markets work. And I've actually always railed against that. I'm like, no. Democracy emerged from free markets, and the human beings working out, like, because I believe like capitalism, if I was to define it as the process of taking your own scarce resources, which is time and energy, and mixing them with natural scarce resources to produce something of greater value, sort of transforming chaos into order in a sense, like that, the capitalist process, because time, energy, and natural resources are capital, that process kind of permeates all of existence. Since we, first threw a fucking stick at an animal, and we realized that, if we threw a bent stick, it might hit the animal better. Like that is the capitalist process of like, using less energy for a better outcome, right? So capitalism has always permeated existence. Like we want to do more with less. It's the natural process of innovation in life. And political systems kind of emerge from, this process, right? Like their attempts at trying to channel perhaps that energy or that capitalist force. So for me, like democracy is an outcome, or majoritarian rule is an outcome of free markets. But for me, it's like if I zoom out, it's almost like a transitory period, because we, and Hans Hermann Hoppe talks about this a lot, with the fall of monarchies, like we tried to replace the king with some sort of majoritarian public institution with no skin in the game, as an attempt to make society better. But in many ways we fucked it all up because we removed skin in the game from the rulers and all this sort of shit. But basically, I feel like democracy was almost an inevitable outcome of the free market experimentation. But it's the effect of free markets, not the other way around. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that. And
Yeah, I totally
democracy and
agree
all
with
that stuff.
you. I kind of view the world as like, to me, I always get confused when people describe anarchism as a political philosophy, because to me that seems quite apparent that anarchism is just a description of the state of nature, like not the state of nature in terms of philosophical, but like just the state of reality is inherently going to be anarchical. Any institutions that kind of exist are going to be transient, and their power is going to be relative to the other ones that are competing in the system. And you can have new states spring up at any time, essentially, and kind of challenge the status quo. And so, to me, the progression between anarchism to anarcho-capitalism is just those. That also seems like a logical, like you can't have one without the other, because in any anarchical system, capital is always going to be a way of communicating information and making things happen. And then you can follow that logic a little bit further and then go, okay, well, if you want to live in a society that's protecting your rights and freedoms as much as possible, then why wouldn't you be happy to provide some capital in order to make that system feasible, which is then sort of the royalist, monarchist position, I guess you could say, which is just using the terminology of old in terms of wanting to have a source of concentrated power that's going to be the most effective at producing the outcomes you want to see. In the same way that like a CEO of a company would, or something like that. But then because it's being applied to a political institution, just call them a monarch instead of I mean, I guess a president is versatile. That goes both ways.
So, okay. Before we get into the royalism, because I'm tempted to go down there, let's lay a few more layers to this. I guess one note I've got here is you mentioned, in democracy, there's this idea that the people keep the government in check, but what about who keeps the people in check? And you sort of get into this kind of loop. This that doesn't like make sense. Like I called it who watches the watchmen, and who's sort of the final arbiter. So what's an answer for that? And I guess this is going to dump us right into the royalism thing anyway, but whatever. Like what's a way to, like, how do you keep power, in particular concentrated power, in check? Like, what's your thoughts there?
The truth is that like I basically any sort of solution you describe is always going to be fallible. That's kind of it's an eternal problem that is going to be struggled with. In the podcast episode, I talk about how you've kind of got these countervailing forces of force and finance, and
Mhm.
one can always corrupt the other. And so you're always going to be, it's like either somebody with a lot of money is going to come in and buy physical power in order to make the rules of the game more amicable towards them, or they, if they're not purchasing power, then they have physical force. And so it doesn't matter if somebody else has more money because they'll just go and grab it away from them. So that's a problem that applies to basically any political system. If you're doing democracy, it's like, well, what if the politicians get corrupt? Like that's what the issue we're dealing with right now. Broadly speaking, that you can always have force and finance kind of manipulating the system to create unfair advantages. So the solution I propose is essentially, or it's not my proposition, this has come way before me. Curtis Yarvin, or Mencius Moldbug, is the guy who coined the term royalism and kind of describes this really well in his online blog from like 2008. But essentially the proposition is, instead of trying to tease these two competing forces apart, and I kind of talk about in the episode how it's like conservatives tend to be more concerned with abuses of physical force and being coerced into doing things they don't want to do, whereas liberals are more concerned with, well, what happens when one person or institution gets too much monetary ability to kind of coerce things, which can only happen in an institution where you're able to purchase political power. So the idea is, well, if you just unite these two things and make them really strong, but really easy to identify and pinpoint as, well, this is the source of all localized finance. It's got all of the money and it's also got as much physical power as is possible. Then there's nobody that can kind of buy off the king or go and kill him in the middle of the night and take over the power, because you've centered both of these ways of empowering in like one node, which could fall at any time, I suppose. But the idea is, well, that's a better solution towards, at least insofar as if you're just taking for granted, well, the state is going to survive in this inception, that's the best way to produce productive outcomes. I don't think I really answered your question there. You got a little off track.
All good, all good. Off track is great. I mean, I don't know if there is even an answer. Like I have some ideas here which sort of pertain to scale, removing the financial power and competition in general, which I think are things like, I just want to bookmark them for a second because there's some other notes that I want to make. But I get what you mean. I think the idea of creating a node, I think that's good terminology, where where there's no confusion. Like I was actually saying this to someone the other day, like with the whole El Salvador thing and them making Bitcoin legal tender, and someone's like, yeah, well, the president's a dictator. I was like, well, I would prefer a dictator over a fucking democracy, because at least it's clear. You know what I mean? Like there's none of this sort of veiled bullshit that goes on behind the scenes, because like then there's no one to pinpoint. Like it's just this sort of this, in a democracy, there is no one to hold accountable. But over here, like, that guy. And I think that's maybe it's a unpopular opinion, or an unconventional opinion, maybe not to the people listening to the podcast, but I think in general, like people, believe this sort of illusion that some sort of, public entity elected by, the people or whatever is the ideal structure for rule. But I don't know, have you read Democracy, the God That Failed by Hans Hermann Hoppe?
No, I haven't.
Holy shit, you would love that. Like, I think, I know we keep giving each other homework, but like that one, like each chapter is so dense. Like you just read one chapter and sort of be done with the book. But like each chapter is so dense that, he kind of makes he destroys the notion of the idea of like a a group of people without skin in the game can be elected or supposedly elected by people to perform functions for a short period of time for property they have no ownership in and therefore have no reason to care about long term. And it kind of like introduces the wrong incentive in society. And you get people who don't care about the capital, they care about the cash flow. So they care about milking the system as much as they can for the period that they're in it, without considering the long-term repercussions and consequences. So he makes a case actually for how monarchies were superior to democracy because the monarch actually had skin in the game, like he had a vested interest in the continuation of his rule, whether or through the continuation of his dynasty, empire, or whatever the case might be. Notwithstanding the fact that you do get some retards in monarchies, but he lays out a whole series of examples of how monarchs had their own natural limitations based on how much wealth they had, and because war was extremely expensive, they would marry their children off instead and create an alliance, which was a better way to settle a conflict than to go and blow each other up, which is what we seem to do in democracies. There's a whole thing there.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to mention, it seems like when you're asking about kind of why we all like the idea, or we're taught to like the idea of democracy so much, is it's tapping into sort of a truth about the fact that groups of people can have a collective intelligence that's higher than any single individual, but that it doesn't, the method of obtaining that intelligence isn't through, well, everybody just kind of pool. It's like democracy is trying to mimic the benefits of a complex adaptive system where you've got all these different people going off and kind of making their own calls, and then somehow the whole does this amazing thing that's better than any of the parts of it. But the problem is that those are all agents in the ant colony or something that are self-motivated. They're not doing anything. They're not all getting together in a big circle and all the ants are kind of saying, okay, boys, tomorrow we're going north, and they all go north together. Like that's what a democracy does. In a complex system, it's like all the ants are kind of doing whatever. And then if it turns out there's a big pile of food north, then the system will naturally pull more and more ants towards that direction. So yeah, royalism is essentially taking the notion of complexity and applying it to markets, which is then going to generate political systems, but those political systems can be very variable and changeable, and they can be, it doesn't have to be just one node that's complete top-down control. The idea is you want to have a myriad of different systems that are all operating by different principles, and then the subjects, the agents, are able to move between the systems in accordance with what is representing their values most accurately. So the same way, it's not like you go to the grocery store and you're all voting on if they're going to have bananas or bread tomorrow. It's like the consumers are naturally creating a demand that then the store is fulfilling. But so it's like there's the collective intelligence is occurring, but it's not a consequence of a democratic process.
Absolutely. The example there about like buying fucking bananas at a store is perfect. And I always use this example to try and explain to people like how stupid voting is, for example. Like, like when you really start to break down voting, like economic action, is voting. Like when I buy a banana or I buy, a piece of meat, that's actually my vote. In the most meaningful sense, as opposed to me getting together with a group of people and deciding that we should all eat fucking steak this week. And then the poor vegetarian is like, well, I don't want to. So then he's got to go out and lobby everyone to convince everyone that we should all eat vegetables this week, not meat. And it's the most inefficient way for collective systems to function, as opposed to just letting, individuals be agents and actually decide, and that's where sort of the difference between free market thinking and democratic thinking actually, I think that's where the line can really be drawn. And democracy just being kind of like we stated earlier, an attempt to try and channel collective thinking based on these days it's not even the majority. These days it's whoever fucking screams and bitches the loudest, basically gets what they want. You know, we sort of live in the oppression Olympics. It's like I'm a single mom with 3 retarded babies and I should have more than you should. And you know, it's just fucking wild, like how that like deranges itself. But all right, we're on the same page there. Man, there's a whole little section in here where I want to talk about. I want to challenge the idea of might is right, because I know you mentioned that, and this is sort of for me ties in with anarchism, because I know you had some, I guess, what's the word? Criticism, I guess, of anarchism and anarcho-capitalism, I guess, in episode 6. But you mentioned might is right, and in a way that's sort of, I don't know how nature organizes itself, but am I putting words in your mouth here, or like am I?
Here, well, what would I say? Yeah, well, it's not necessarily much a critique of anarchism or anarcho-capitalism. It's just that those are insufficient as in terms of a political philosophy. Saying I'm an anarchist or I'm an anarcho-capitalist doesn't tell anyone else anything meaningful about like, okay, well, what consequence does that have on my life? Because if the idea is, well, just use your money to go and purchase the best political system, okay, well, what does it look like? You're evading the more difficult questions of politics. In terms of might being right, I guess that kind of ties into sort of the Machiavellian point of view that there is some natural kind of, well, yeah, if you want to create effective outcomes, you need to have some power in some capacity. And then I guess the question being, if over the long term, abuses of power are going to naturally kind of fall by the wayside of the system because they aren't principled in a way that means that they produce more effective outcomes. So might is both right and not right. It depends on if you're looking on a short-term timescale or long-term timescale, right? You could say being a bully in the short term, you know, instead of learning how to fish, you go and kill a fisherman and eat his food or something. Like, okay, great, you ate that night. But then if you just go around attacking other people to get resources, then you haven't actually learned anything. And so then long term, well, you're going to starve to death because you never learned how to fish. So the might of the fishermen in terms of the ones who are selling lots of fish and creating markets for it and selling, and then they're gaining power that is deserved in some sense. So it kind of goes both ways.
Yeah, interesting. So I like the idea about the time scales, because I think scale is something people rarely ever talk about. You know, scale in terms of, you know, quantity, but also scale in terms of time frames. And because like my notes here is like, you know, I'm not sure I agree with might is right. You know, might is a relative term. You know, I was going to make a point that competence and merit are actually what drive
yes,
position. Exactly.
Yeah.
But to your point, like, you know, competence and merit are long-term sustainable, whereas in you know, many cases, you know, violence is short-term. I guess gives you the illusion of benefit, but like you said, you go and shoot the farmer, and then, I mean, typical USSR, right? Like they killed all the farmers and then they died of starvation. So like it's you know, does that open up the question of like, you know, does the discussion of a, you know, political system perhaps deal with, you know, more the short-term behavior of the individuals within a society or within a group, because sort of the longer term corrective mechanism for behavior is, you know, is sort of driven by underlying competence and merit. Like, so that kind of takes care of itself, perhaps. You know, the system corrects itself for competence and merit longer term, but it's like, how do we how do we, I don't know, manage, in a sense, manage may not be the right word, but sort of the short-term predisposition for violence by stupid people who don't want to put the time in for competence and merit. Like, would that be a, like, I don't know if I'm asking a question there, but like, that be a valid statement question? I don't know.
I guess well, as you're talking, I'm kind of just thinking about different forms of power and how we kind of think of that
Mm,
as by definition being a negative thing, but that's not necessarily true. The question power always begs is like, well, how did it come to be in that position? Because you can have somebody who's powerful based off of their merit and they're using it for good ends, and then you want powerful people in that context. What you don't want is powerful people that have it just because they happened upon it and are undeserving. So yeah, I guess my point generally is that like over what you're saying, over the long term, those abuses of power are naturally going to get weeded out of any system just because they're not sustainable long term. And I think that's a fundamental like truth of reality. So in terms of persuading people away from those sorts of abuses, I don't know how much utility there is there in other than just like, yeah, I mean, it's not effective, but those people don't seem like they'd be very interested in listening either. So I think you just kind of let the matter sort itself out on its own.
yeah, well, I guess that's where the, hold on, I'm just gonna pop some notes here. That's where kind of the idea of a political system then emerges, right? So that the function of a political system is how do you minimize the short-term noise that emerges from people trying to fucking shoot themselves and use violence as a means of acquiring power, as opposed to competence and merit. And I'm just spitballing here, like maybe that's actually what a political system or a social system is actually trying to solve. It's not trying to solve the long-term natural corrective mechanism of a complex system which gets better through competence and merit. It's actually trying to solve the short-term propensity of individuals to try and find a shortcut to power, perhaps. I don't
Yeah,
know.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree with what you're saying.
Okay. Let's then roll into royalism and citadels, which Bitcoiners would call it. So this for me definitely, like, when you sent me, it was Mencius Moldbug who wrote the Patchwork, right? Yeah, when you sent me that, like, and I just saw the title, like, it just straight up like resonated with me. I was like, fuck yes, because I've always actually, when I was younger, the people that I read about, the heroes that inspired me were people like, William Wallace, or, Alexander the Great, or, Attila the Hun, or Julius Caesar, like, sort of. And yes, in the ancient times, there was a lot of, climbing to power through, killing and slaughtering your enemies and shit like that. But there was a level of competence, that was required in order to be a king, right? Like, in order to have, some sort of royalty. And I truly, truly, truly believe in, the idea of like regality, royalty, like, noblemen, and sort of like an emergent set of individuals who kind of rise above the rest, not by vote but by natural competence. Like, so anyway, when I saw the book, like, I bought it straight away, and I haven't read it yet, but it just, listening to your episode, whether it was 7 or 8, whichever one it was, just really resonated with me. So can we talk through a little bit about royalism and some of the premises of it?
Sure. Yeah. I guess the easiest way to describe it is I just like to think of it in terms of, instead of having a debate with your friend or family member or whatever about, what political outcomes are most desirable, just take the entire debate off the table by saying, look, what if you and I could both just pay to create the sorts of societies that we want to live in and then go and live in them and do our own thing? Then we can both have what we want and there's no conflict between the two of us. The only barrier to entry is having the ability to finance your way into this new hypothetical political system. But even that isn't really a barrier if you think about money as just being a shorthand for value, and the fact that, I think if you're to have some smart new sovereign, I like using the example of Elon Musk just because it's funny. If he used to suddenly tomorrow come online and be like, okay, guys, I've secured some little secret island and I've made it really, really cool. And there's self-driving cars and underground tunnels and solar panels and Wi-Fi from space and all these amazing amenities. And you can come live here for the low price of $10,000 a year, which is like, what most people pay in taxes. Or if you don't have that much money, you can come, and because we're offering all these amenities, we need people to pave the roads and weed the gardens and stuff like that. You can just come and we'll hire you as like a indentured servant, I guess, sort of thing. And you can live in the society and pay for the cost of it through your labor. So to me, royalism is a very exciting way of essentially um, providing a system of ideas that allows people to kind of conceptualize different political systems. And then also, I think it's genuinely the most meaningful method of implementation moving into the future. Like, I think we're definitely going to be seeing new countries. Seems a little bit ambitious, but what you said of like citadels or charter cities, like starting in small micro communities that are just experimenting with different sorts of rule structures and stuff like that, you're going to start seeing all these different ways of living coming about, propping up all over the world, being financed by people just going and like extricating themselves from the political systems that they don't enjoy so much. And slowly you'll start approximating better and better systems over time by like market mechanisms.
Could not agree more. Like this is one of the biggest memes in the whole Bitcoin space, is like this idea of us exiting, the idiot globalists who want to sort of turn us into one homogenous sludge and kind of like start building and creating our own. And that's why we kind of call them citadels, but it's basically charter city states, kind of like, what you mentioned is the idea that you have a contract with effectively, like, I almost view them as kind of like the hotel or resort model, right? Like you go to a hotel or a resort and you get a specific set of amenities that you have paid for. And yeah, for me, like I think of it as a membership model. And I've had this discussion with so many people. I think the future is one of people paying voluntary memberships to live within cities, as opposed to having their wealth stolen from them by the state for services that you don't use, that you don't want, that are in disrepair, and that genuinely fucking suck because there's no market incentive to make them better, right? And that's kind of like I call it the moving, like the transformation of where we are today, which is, I think we've got, with our rulers, we have a overlord subject relationship. And I think, as the world progresses, it's going to move into a customer service provider relationship, which kind of fits to me with this charter city state sort of idea. But I guess, that requires a couple things. Like it requires competition. And I don't know if we should introduce sort of Bitcoin here, but like, I don't believe we can get there without humans without being close enough to economic consequence. And this is sort of where the whole Bitcoin thing really comes to fruition for me. Like, and why I think Bitcoin is so important is that in the absence of Bitcoin, like large scale nation states and countries, what we have today, and this sort of push towards like, globalist government, it can only happen when they fund themselves through, indirect taxation, i.e. just fucking printing of money, and through, direct coercive taxation, and through, I guess, the indirect method, which is, you know, regulatory moats, you know, so that way you end up getting, you know, whoever is close enough to the monetary spigot has the capacity to be in the inner circle and have an unfair advantage in the marketplace relative to everybody else, such that you end up getting these unnatural concentrations of power, which is kind of, you know, the world we live in today. And like, for me, you know, until we break that economic fucking fantasy, and kind of move towards a more economic reality, you know, with Bitcoin, you know, being separated out, like, and this is where, you know, I'm going to write a note here, like the separation of money and state is really where Bitcoin sort of really fits in. And then what it does is it actually forces, not through coercion, but just forces through economic reality, whether it's a sovereign or a, you know, a private city provider, to actually provide a service that is of value to the buyer, because they can't fuck around with the money and still, you know, enrich themselves irrespective of, you know, what the client or the consumer wants. Mm-hmm. So, like, I don't know if you got any comment on that, but I just wanted to sort of talk through like how we get there, and, you know, what your thoughts are in terms of like the process from where we are today to there.
I definitely think there's a lot of value in just reframing how people think about, conceptualize their relationship to their government. And instead of buying into this democratic ideal of I'm going to vote to create the changes I want to see around me, and I'm going to go and, you know, campaign for other people to do the same, and you get this really slow kind of like ineffective process that produces a result that's not really what anyone wants, because it's had to bend to so many other people's whims and stuff like that as it's evolved, right? Like nobody wins in a democratic system because it has to kind of be too accommodating to what too many people want simultaneously. So yeah, seeing yourself as not voting to change the circumstance that you exist inside of, but instead of you relocating to a system that's going to accommodate your values as closely as possible. There's this idea that I talk about in the podcast where, like, another reason I don't like anarchism is because they kind of try to create a separation between the notion of protection and the relationship that it necessarily must have to land, where there's this idea of like, oh yeah, people can just have private protection agencies and you can have all these people living in a community together, even if they're not regulated by any overall central authority that's going to make sure that there's consistency in the interactions. There's going to be all these just disparate regulatory agencies that are going to have to duke it out. To me, it seems quite apparent that like laws have to apply to physical land and space, and you can ensure that those laws are being enforced because of the fact that you've got a monopoly of authority on that territory. And so thinking about the rules that you are subject to is not something that you are customizing your environment, surrounding environment to cater to your preferences, but rather, well, if I want to live somewhere where there's it's really, really cheap to live, there's like really low taxes, and, you know, people build their own roads or whatever, like that's an option, and I go and live where that's going to be enabled and supported. Or you go and live in some little gated community where the rules are much more strict and you're paying a higher premium, but then you're also getting access to higher quality services. But so seeing yourself as like, it should be on the individual agent to relocate themselves into the context that is going to make them the happiest, and maybe that'll change over time, rather than trying to customize your environment to cater to your needs in the short term. And that kind of has principles that tie in with complexity as well, but I'm not sure if I want to get into that. But yeah.
Yeah, okay, let's jump into it, because I do want to also dig into the private land ownership stuff, and then kind of, yeah, there's so much shit here I want to dig into. So so talk to me about the how it ties into competition.
Or complexity.
Oh, sorry, complexity. Yeah. Complexity. Fuck.
No worries. And it's hard because I've not really kind of, like, to me, something about the notion of having competing political landscapes, and then you're seeing yourself as you're situating yourself into these different environments. And the environments can still kind of evolve and change over like a longer term to cater to people's needs. Um, but yeah, essentially just you putting yourself into a system that's going to support your values the most effectively. If everybody's doing that, then over the long term, you're going to start seeing, well, the most effective sovereign that's offering the best package deal is going to get more money and more power, and then they can expand their domain or their territory, and you get these feedback loops that are then going to have these market mechanisms essentially creating desirable political ends.
Okay, yep. I want to talk about, you just reminded me, I want to talk about dynamic equality as well. Maybe I should call it dynamic inequality, and castes. Okay, yes. So I think that sort of reminds me of how, again, like how natural free markets work, right? Like if you're a good business operator, and you run a really good cafe, you have, you can then roll out and open another cafe, and you can sort of double your productivity, and double your, I think, start sort of compounding. You might want to create a franchise, etc., etc. And almost like, I actually think that long term we're probably going to have franchised models for cities. In fact, have you heard of the Prospera Group and like what they're doing in Honduras?
Not maybe vaguely. Prospera?
Yeah, Prospera. So it's I think the website's prospera.hm. So I'm going to be swinging over there in like the next month or two, but they've basically effectively got a charter. They've got I think it's, I don't remember the size of it now, but it's a big chunk of Roatan Island that they've got an agreement with the Honduran government that they've got their own jurisdiction, it's their own rules, and they're kind of like they're kind of almost like a governance provider, and they've got a 1% flat company tax rate, 1% flat property tax rate, and a 10% flat employee tax rate. And the agreement that they've got with the Honduran government is that the government is going to be able to earn 12.5% of the income that is generated from this private city. So like this stuff is beginning to occur. Like that's an example of that, and they want to long term, if kind of figure out the model and perhaps franchise it long term. I know my personal ambition long term is I want to grow Amber, which is the the Bitcoin app that I've got today. Then I want to take a few years of like, I want to do some writing, but then after that I actually want to go build private cities. I just think that is the next $1 trillion industry, or multi-Bitcoin industry, since we're not going to be using dollars anymore. But like it's the when the paradigm shifts towards that service provider and customer relationship in a city versus the overlord subject relationship that we have now, you actually get improvement versus what we have today. Like, and you mentioned it in your pod, is like any government service that you look at, whether it's roads or buildings or fucking whatever it is, it's there's no incentive to make the shit better. So it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse and worse, and we're sort of like destroying everything we have around us. And it's got to break at some point. Sorry, go on.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say, like, lots of the faults that people identify with capitalism as well, I think so much more often are actually a consequence of having really crappy government infrastructure, where everyone hates living in a city that's parking lots and roads and traffic lights and big box stores. We all agree it's ugly and horrific and we don't like it. And it's, it's serving utilitarian ends in the short term. So I'm not like, too upset about it or whatever. But it's like the only thing that's stopping us from living in cities that are completely autonomous vehicles and pedestrians and cyclists and big long beautiful gardens and European style architecture and all the rest of it. It's because there's no economic incentive for the government to start providing those things to you. And even if some private developer wanted to go and create all those things, in some sort of, fancy gated community or whatever it is, then they're paying such ridiculous taxes on everything. It's not really feasible because it's occurring within a system that's constraining their abilities to do things so much. Like so much of the distastefulness of our current environment is a consequence of regulatory bodies that are like enforcing certain standards that nobody likes. But like I know in my city, my mom was saying like there has to be for every 3 office workers in the downtown or something, there has to be 1 parking space, something like that. So then of course you just have a whole downtown that's just parking lots everywhere and nobody likes it. But like, it's because you're creating what you were saying earlier about like, top-down structures not lasting for the temporary environments. Cars are only like 100-year technology, more or less, right? Like very quickly we'll be moving to a spot where that's no longer necessary. And suddenly we've got all of these legacy rules which are inhibiting where our technology has brought us to. So yeah, there's a really big contradiction happening, which is also part of the benefit of having a monarchical system, is because if you just have one person who can go, oh yeah, this rule doesn't make any sense anymore, we're going to get rid of that one. You can do it overnight rather than having all this changes kind of accumulate and nobody's really thinking about these things and all the rest of it. And then you just have all these bad constraints pile up and no incentive to break them apart again or kind of reassess them.
100%. The cars thing makes me laugh actually, is because I was speaking to someone about this, and you always like the classic statist rebuttal to the libertarian is like, who's gonna build the roads, right? It's like, I actually have a theory that had it not been for government confiscation of people's wealth going towards building roads, I actually don't think we would have the ugly ass fucking congested cities and highways and all that sort of shit. Like, we would have actually worked out far better ways. Like, the market itself would have worked out far better ways for transport and for like I guess communal density or city density, kind of like what we had. And you mentioned this, is like Europe, like before we had the fucking roads, you've got like in Europe, like these beautiful pedestrian walking cities where you can get everything. You just walk around. Like, you go to a modern city, you can't fucking get anywhere. Like, it's impossible to get anywhere. And there's no public transport, or the public transport's a fucking disaster. And I actually think that's a function of, I wish we never had roads. Like, I think it's a really inefficient transportation mechanism. But
yeah,
anyway,
absolutely. Subsidizing an inefficient technology that's creating a lot of pollution and all the rest of it. And going off
exactly.
of that, regulations like like if you go to Paris or something, like the entire city is like 6-floor buildings. The reason we don't see that so much in North America is because there's building codes that require, after 3 floors, you have to install an elevator, so it's handicap accessible. Even though like 99% of your population doesn't require that. And you could have a much more, charming city if you could build these buildings that would be great for like storefronts on the bottom and people can live up top and all the rest of it. It's not allowed. And so then you don't see, nice things being implemented.
Madness. Okay, I'm so glad we agree on that. That's fucking hilarious. Okay, so I wanted to dig into private land ownership. So you kind of made a statement, which is a statement that I've made in the past, and I want to, like, Stefan Kinsella, who I had on in a previous podcast, kind of talked about this. But my point was, private property, in terms of land, is that which you can defend. And I think you kind of said something similar in your pod. So can you talk me through like that, and what your position is on private land ownership, etc.? I'm really curious about that one.
Yeah, going off of what I said before about the state being an entity that necessarily must exist kind of over a given territory in order for it to exert meaningful control, means that the state is the one securing your property, exactly what you just said. And so the extent to which you own your house and the land that it's built on is entirely dependent upon, how the long-term longevity of the country that you're existing inside of. Because the moment the country collapses, you can't go and tell the foreign invaders like, no, you don't understand, like, I own this house. you can bring like your phone and your money with you and run in the opposite direction, but the land itself, it's like that's going to be the property of whoever is occupying the territory. And so part of the kind of political framework that I describe is that one valid issue that people often identify with capitalism is the fact that, first, not first come, first serve, but like people having legacy ownership over land, which they purchased a long time ago or was passed down through their family or whatever, that's then increased in value over time, means that they have kind of unearned monopoly power in a domain that's like land is kind of, obviously there's lots of limited resources, but that's something where like you're not making any more of it, and it's kind of unique in terms of it can't be moved around, and so it is what it is. And what am I trying to say? Essentially, give me a second.
That's all right. Take your time.
I think people need to rent their land from the government is where I'm going, because that's something that you can't own in perpetuity, and the state is what's making your occupation of that territory possible in the first place. And so it makes sense that, like, if you're occupying more space, then that's going to be more costly to the government and stuff like that. So to me, it just seems like it's called Georgism, is the mode of like using rents on land as like the general form of taxation. And I kind of think you can have a mixed taxation model where you're doing different things in that sort of like subscription service, right, to pay for the amenities that people are using. But to me, the notion of, instead of a single individual owning their land in perpetuity, that's going to generate like unfair monopolistic power. And so if you're paying annual rents on the territory, then that's a way of guaranteeing that you're not getting like rent-seeking behavior where you have a landlord who's not providing any additional value and they're still collecting a check year after year. If they're paying for continual rent on the land, then you're kind of equalizing the playing field a little bit. And there's a philosophical justification for doing that, because land has this different property and necessary relationship to the government that other forms of private property don't possess.
Yeah, interesting. How do we dig into this one? So let's start where we agree. So I agree that land does have a slightly different relationship, and I hadn't thought about this as, the capacity to take it with you, right? So that's interesting. And then, your capacity to occupy the land is not entirely dependent on the state, but I guess, the ability to abstract abstracting your ability to protect the land or have your private property rights upheld, is easier when there is a larger state there. I don't know about this idea of renting the land from the state, because I guess I don't know, like I don't know what sort of incentives that introduces into the system. Is like, when it's not yours, you don't really take care of it. Like, it's kind of
I think it introduces good incentives for environmental protections, actually, because if you own the land, then there's not like, and you discover there's some valuable resource on it or something, you're going to be extracting that resource as fast as you possibly can and turning a profit on it. And that's not really accounting for the fact that it's the existence of the state which is enabling that extraction to occur in the first place. And go on.
I was gonna rebut that one with let's use tree logging as an example. So you can sort of log trees. You got a forest, and there's three mechanisms via which you can extract the timber from the forest. So you sort of have the complete collectivist model, like the USSR or communism, who have no pricing signals, and they just want to determine how much of the wood everybody gets. So they deforest the whole fucking place with no price signals and they completely fuck it up. So, the wrong people get too much wood and the wrong people get too little wood, and it's a disaster, right? The second method is kind of what you're describing, which is, in a sense, some sort of almost public ownership of it. Or maybe it's not public ownership because you're talking about a sovereign owning it.
Yeah, the government's the custodian, and they get to set the rules by which the citizens need to interact with the land. So I like it because that way you can have strong rules against like pollution and deteriorating the natural resources. The government can step in and say, well, yeah, you can log, but you can only do this amount per year, or you have to replant this quantity or something. It's in the government's long-term interest to have healthy land available, rather than somebody just going to jump in, make a quick buck, and jump out again, and then they've washed their hands of it.
Perhaps. So I think there's a natural corrective mechanism in private property that enables the preservation of the capital without needing the rule to be enforced by a sovereign. So in the scenario where you've got I'll use today as a scenario more so than your hypothetical example of a prince, because I think there's something else there, like because I would argue that the prince is actually the private property owner, but to a larger degree. But if we look at today's public property ownership structure, which is the government is the custodian of this forest that I mentioned before. So in the first case, the government is the custodian and owner of the forest, and they distribute the wood and they fuck it all up because they have no pricing signals. In the second one, they say, all right, the government is the custodian of the forest, but hey, as a government, we're not sure how to distribute the wood, so we will allow private enterprises to come in and to harvest the lumber, because they have they are in touch with the marketplace, and they know how to price it better, so they can more efficiently extract the lumber and distribute it in the marketplace. So we will rent them a license to do so. Now, the problem in this scenario is that those who rent the licenses, so the tenants, so not the custodian of the resource itself, they're actually incentivized to make the most they can of the license whilst they can. And even if there is some sort of restrictions placed by the owner of the land, they can be influenced to say that, hey, we need more fucking wood because the market is booming, so we need to get this. So what they do is like that there is a natural tendency to rape and pillage the resource, because the entity who is renting it for the sake of generating cash flow doesn't have a capital cost underneath. So they'll want to just use it up and then move on to the next. Whereas in the third scenario, where you have private property ownership of the forest, so if I'm the company that is producing the lumber, but I also own the forest, I would be a fucking moron to go and chop down all my trees in the first year and not replant anything, because I'll put myself out of business. So I want to look after my land and take care of it. And in much the same way as owning your own slab of land, your own house, your own car, for example. Like I know if I rent a car, fucking hell, like I take speed bumps at 150 kilometers an hour just to see how much air I can get. But I don't do that in my own car. So it's like, so I feel like there's a tricky thing here. So maybe the introduction of a monarch or a prince or a president or some sort of thing there, in a sense, acts as the private property owner as opposed to a more faceless public property owner. But see, I guess maybe my argument here is that doesn't remove the notion of private property, it just puts it at a different scale, perhaps.
So yeah, I agree with your critiques and what you're saying about, it's best to have one person who's they've got a vested long-term interest in the health of the land. And so exactly what you're saying in terms of, technically there is somebody who's privately owning the land, it's just the sovereign. But then the subjects that are coming and going, my thought process is that essentially, if you're thinking about like that, if you've just got that forest or something and you're the person who's protecting it, from other people coming and messing with it, and maybe you want like some people to come and do some logging, but you're not going to be that person. You're just going to contract that work out and make it available for other people to come and do it because you're occupied with just preserving the space. Then that's when the idea of rents becomes a valuable tool, I think, because if you're saying, oh, I'll just sell this scrap of forest to you in perpetuity that I'm protecting, then you're getting a one-time payment for something that you're going to be paying for, however long into the future. And so you're
What,
actually
why are you paying for it into the future? Do you mean as the sovereign you're paying for it because you still need to protect it, or?
yeah, yes. Yeah, the cost of
Okay.
protection is something that's gonna, it's gonna have some sort of, maybe you build a big wall in the first year and then you're paying off the cost in subsequent ones or something. But there's always gonna be some sort of cost associated with protecting the state, and that'll of course vary depending upon what sort of external threats are making that land more or less valuable. Um, so yeah, if somebody pays once, then they're actually getting too good of a deal because you can't go and continue to be like, hey, it's still costing me money to protect this for you to profit off of. So I need to see some of that, please. And then also what you're saying, if you have somebody who is a bad actor who decides, oh, I'm going to step in and buy this and then just clear cut this entire little scrap, and maybe the rest of the forest is fine because that's being managed by this other person, but you're still operating by whatever, short-term profit principles. Whereas if the person who's renting you the land has the ability to say, well, actually, no, you can only, extract things in these ways, or you can only pollute these sorts of chemicals into the air or whatever it is, then they're going to be ensuring that the quality of the land is maintained over time, because that means that once you're done logging this little bit of forest and planting some new trees or doing whatever it is, and you leave, the next person can come in and continue to profit off of it. So as a sovereign, you're making money long term rather than just in the short term.
Yeah, but what about the sovereign charging for protection services anyway? I don't think they're losing money by selling the land to private property owners in the first, because I feel like that kind of ends up trending back towards a state with a more traditional monopoly. Because I guess I've got a note in here says that the prince, the royal is the owner of the property, to a larger, at a larger scale, right? But in order for the prince to remain honest, and this kind of answers the question of who watches the watchman, is like he must remain at risk of challenge, and that challenge must come from competing private property owners. Hence the natural requirement for what I kind of call like lords or nobles. So it's like, without, like, I feel like a complex system has to have, challenge sort of inbuilt. And if, one entity has total private property rights, whereas all other entities only have transient, rental rights, like you don't get the natural competitive nature. Like there's a book I might recommend called The Territorial Imperative. It's an anthropological book by a guy called Robert Ardrey. Okay. And me reading that, like, it kind of made me like, so he makes the point that before sex as the driver for natural selection, it's actually territory is the fundamental driver of all natural selection in evolution, and all of nature actually uses territory as the means through which to organize itself and find equilibrium. And for me, like, I kind of view private property as the human or social the human social manifestation of the territorial imperative, like the sort of biological innate link we have with land. And I just think that, I don't know, I mean, maybe in my patchwork section of the city, I will sell the land to other people, because I feel like if I sell it to them, they will take better care of it. Now, in the contract, there could be rules around what they can do maybe not what they can do with the land, but what they can do with, perhaps chemicals or pollution that might affect other landowners, in which case, there'll be some sort of, penalty associated with that.
Mhm.
But I just, I don't know. I can't
I
seem to
think
get
we're
on board with
I
the
think we're
idea of,
thinking on different levels of scale, because what you're saying
mm,
about, well, yeah, if that one power authority has all the power over the land, then of course, yeah, they're going to have monopolistic power and they can kind of inhibit other competition internally. Yeah, yeah, of course. But that's the point, right? That you want to have as much power exercised over this given territory as possible in accordance with a certain set of principles. So the state by design is able to challenge any sort of competing territory. You could have, like, one thing I like talking about a lot is this patchwork model. You can think of it in terms of like different patches, but also in terms of complexity, I like thinking of it in terms of like nested substructures that can kind of be like a heat map or something, where they're kind of, you can think of like different colors representing different sets of rules, and they can kind of be hills and valleys, and some are larger and some are smaller. And so the rules that are being enforced can be variable to some degree, but they're all abiding by broader libertarian principles that's keeping things consistent. And you've got a sovereign that's enforcing these things. So you could experiment with other sorts of subsystems inside. But in terms of the territory itself, to me, it seems like that's the one thing that has to be expressly, the power over it is absolute insofar as it can be, because otherwise, how are you supposed to be exercising meaningful agency over the subjects? So if you want competition to occur, it has to occur from outside of the system, new other
external.
territories.
Yeah, okay. Mm. What about, what about so do you think that a poorly run patch, or a poorly run city in that case would collapse under its own incompetence because of the fleeing of, the citizens within it? Like they'll go somewhere else?
Possibly. Or one thing I talk about too is that the Patrick model is kind of nice, or more specifically, the economically incentivizing rulers to want to rule well and as many people as possible means that right now there's not a whole lot of reason. Like, everybody in the world can look at North Korea and go like, oh, like, sucks for them, that's so messed up. But nobody has any personal vested interest in going over and going to war with North Korea. It's like, no, that's there's no point. And nobody has any like real skin in the game as to why they'd want to do that outside of like intense humanitarian issues. But if you introduce a profit motive, maybe instead of North Korea, you can say, yeah, this whatever small and competently run city or patch or whatever. If some other business guy is like looking over being like, oh, they're doing a really bad job at managing these things, I can either purchase them outright, or, you could, this is where the Machiavellianism comes in, like, well, or just go and invade them. I mean, if there's people that are being like persecuted in this situation, then maybe they wouldn't mind some invading power to come and liberate them from their oppressors and institute a more effective political system.
Mm. Yeah, so I agree with that. I just also wonder what the role is for, an internal, I guess, emancipation, for lack of a better term. And this is sort of where I think, um, I don't know, it's a challenging one, because this is where, like, I've got 5 points here about citadels. Is like, yeah, scale, the removal of financial power, competition, separation of money and state, and sort of dynamic inequality or caste. So it's like, um, your point is very similar. It's analogous to the idea of, I'm a cafe owner and I'm a really competent, hospitality person, and there's a cafe down the road run by a fucking moron. I'll just go and buy it, because he's crap, and then I can actually provide a better service to it. So it's like, the idea there that the monarch might, sell their patch of land to someone else, for example. But the idea that, I feel like it may not need to get to that if there is some sort of competitive force internally, with, someone who is, because you've also got the idea that, people or constituents of this jurisdiction also, actually provide input in making the city better. Like, they build businesses and they, provide products and services, etc. And, they're, I don't, the ability for somebody to, let's say, start from nothing, and amass enough private property, amass enough resources to be powerful enough to start, acquiring and potentially, from the inside actually become, the lord or the prince or the sovereign.
But a solution to the problem you're suggesting is the idea that, like, because I'm always just about, at some point you have to assert your right to exist, and that's kind of you're territorializing, right? And then if as long as you are capable of territorializing, then you can establish whatever rule set within that may work or not work, and that will determine how long the system exists for. So you're totally right. Like, okay, I think we should rent, you think we should own in perpetuity. Patchwork says both, just try it out, see what works better. But also, in terms of your concern with my point of view, you could also just have somebody who's renting a bunch of land and then one day has enough power that they've got, either physical or financial, that then whoever the current sovereign is, they're like, okay, actually this new little nest that I've created within your broader territory, we're putting up our own walls now, and we're declaring autonomy. Like, you could technically just have
Sure.
the
Yeah.
little
Okay.
revolutions within the system. I'm not
That's
sure
fair.
how that would go over necessarily, but yeah, the ability to kind of assert yourself needs to exist, but also there's always going to be forces that are inhibiting that from occurring, right? So it's like a never ending, well, yeah, you can't guarantee anything, that who watches the watchers, it's just an infinite regress. At some point you have to kind of hope that competence is going to be steering things, broadly speaking, in the direction they need to go.
Yeah, turtles all the way down. Okay, so then let's talk about scale then. So when you think about the patchwork thing, like, what one thing that I've said for a couple of years now is that, we'll live in a world where we have, 10 million cities as opposed to 200 countries. Like, and, I think we'll have, leagues of city states and stuff like that. What's your thought about the scale element of sort of this patchwork idea of these charter cities?
I think I could do anything. Haven't really, because I'm always doing things bottom up, it's like, okay, I focus on the internal structure of a state that I think be effective first, and then the IR kind of consequences of that's further down the line. I think I could see it going in both ways, where, yeah, of course, you're going to have lots of competition and lots of small city states that exist and come and go and all these things. But then also, because of this sort of complexity Pareto 80-20 notion, it also seems to me very likely that over time, as you have natural competition between these competing systems, and generally speaking, I think people want to live abiding by similar sets of principles. It would make sense to me that, well, you will still have 20% of those new nations, be they city states or kind of more broad. I'm not sure what term you use when it's like you can have a bunch of cities all over the world that are still unified and you can fly back and forth between them and stuff like that, or taking
Like
up
a
large.
league or something, right?
Yeah, exactly. So you still might have ones that are much more dominating in the political sphere, but that's a good thing, actually, right? It means that they're using their power well and they're providing a thing that people want. So the notion that you're still going to have some really big global players that are controlling most things is fine, because you're always leaving that possibility for people to, that one ant to wander in a different direction and find something new that's actually a better solution that will then slowly get brought in, and you'll start seeing consequences across the system.
So, okay, so one of the predicates there that you're discussing is the capacity for individuals to actually be able to move out, right? Like to opt out. So if they don't like something, they need to move somewhere else, because I guess what gives these future city states power is actually having customers, right? To generate income from. In the absence of customers, they're not going to be generating income. So there's that point. But then, yeah, I agree that long term, the most functional model will, be most replicated. And then, if it's if there's multiple cities operating on a very similar type of model, there's a lot of benefit in forming leagues and alliances, which makes sense. But I feel like the what's really, really important for all of this is the capacity to break away. I feel like one of the biggest risks of this kind of the future is this this attempt by globalist morons to try and remove the ability to opt out. I mean, it's in Australia now, for example, you're not allowed to leave the country because the democratic dictators decided that your health is their responsibility. So based on some sort of emergency, they have literally restricted your capacity to fucking exit. Or another example is in America, right? Like you're a tax slave forever. You actually can't exit that. So I feel like that's the biggest risk for this.
Well, I mean, but that's also something that exists in the status quo, right? That's something I talk about in the 6th episode of this podcast, is the idea that like the oppression and anarchy is the default because you're always going to be born into some system, if that's like a Rousseauian state of nature, or if that's a state of slavery, or if that's just a Western democracy. You're always going to be forced to do things that you don't want to do, or whatever it is. And the desire to be able to extricate yourself from that for whatever motivations is I think important, and something that will always kind of the question is looking for those answers and those solutions, but they can never be completely guaranteed, right? But it's the quest to perpetuate them, and the fact that there is utility in that sort of libertarian idea, which makes it true and desirable, means that I think it'll kept getting brought back to that same point of like, okay, well, there's the status quo, and then there's the person that's totally against it, and there's always going to be a tension between those two forces. And of course, the one person that's against the rest of the globalist system is always going to be at a disadvantage. But you can't do anything about that. That's just the way the world works.
Or it's a transient state. So I guess this is where I want to kind of bring Bitcoin in again, is that you mentioned these city states, or the sovereign or the prince, kind of being a focal point or a node for both like financial power and force, or monopoly on violence. I think Bitcoin throws a curveball into this situation, is because it doesn't actually allow any nodes of financial power to exist, or at least financial power in the way we understand it today, right? Like so like the US has financial power first and foremost because it's got the reserve currency of the world, and it kind of sort of, it's strong, it's closely correlated or closely related to its monopoly on violence globally, by being the entity which can enforce the US dollar as the global currency. But when you actually completely separate money and state, and you place money kind of out here, out of the reach of any sovereign, I think you create a situation where you actually solve the problem of who watches the watchman, because today you can be a sovereign power, so you can be a state, and you can fraudulently keep yourself in power, which means you can fraudulently keep yourself economically viable through the means of producing the money, which is something that you can't do on a Bitcoin standard.
When I talk about the sovereign having like the force and money, I don't mean that they would be in control of the economic system that their state is using. I totally think, like Bitcoin would be a valuable tool to have in any system because of exactly what the reasons you're describing. I mean that they have enough money, they're being motivated by money, and they're also not like suffering from a lack of it, which means that you're not going to run the risk of somebody else coming and purchasing political persuasion through a dollar, because it's like this is already the most empowered person, and so they're not going to care about some bribe that they're being offered, because their vested interest is maintaining a non-corrupt system, because that's going to generate the most revenue in the long term.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, that's a very important point. I mean, well, that comes down to sort of that reminds me almost of, you know, in the ancient times and the medieval times and the times of the Renaissance, like you had these, you know, benefactors who built shit, right? Like they built statues, they built monuments, they built churches, they built all this stuff. Like, you know, the Medicis were a perfect example of that. It's you know, whereas that kind of responsibility has kind of fallen on the state today, and there's no, like, the state doesn't actually give a shit, so they build you a fucking gray box and call it art, you know, like, whereas, you know, the Medicis wanted to leave a legacy. So I think that that's a very valid point. And I think, you know, for me, this also ties into, you know, to the trend, to the, I did a talk recently where I said, you know, Bitcoin's not only the most important economic decision in an individual can make today, but I actually believe it's the most asymmetric economic opportunity in the history of all of humanity. Like, and we're lucky enough to sort of be born at that time, because when you think about, you know, what money represents is, you know, people say that transportation is a big industry, you know, or food is a big industry, or pharmaceuticals is a big industry, or electronics is a big industry. Like, take every fucking industry on the planet that exists, and money is all of it, right? So Bitcoin is the largest possible thing. And when you think about what Bitcoin will represent, it's like, it's going to be, you know, the 21 million Bitcoin. The value of one Bitcoin is going to be infinity. So like everything that exists and everything that will ever exist divided by 21 million. So that'll be the purchasing power of a single Bitcoin. And you know, acquiring Bitcoin now before the rest of the world realizes it actually places you in the position to become a future sovereign, noble, lord, or prince. I honestly believe that. So I think Bitcoin is actually the predicate for the patchwork system actually emerging, because then what you've actually got is individuals who are extraordinarily wealthy. I think one Bitcoin will be enough for you to build an entire sovereign fucking chartered city of decent proportion. But because we're all operating on a common monetary standard, and we can't get an unfair advantage at the expense of someone else in the system by being able to print money, what you get is this natural dynamic equilibrium of economic competition. Like, we all are facing the same economic reality. Like, because currently today, like, we can lie to ourselves. The US can go and print $6 trillion or borrow. Like, you know, there used to be a thing called the debt ceiling. Now they don't give a fuck. They just like continue to borrow from the future. And it's not at their own expense. It's actually at the expense of our future resources and, you know, the people born down the track. So we can play this fake game and actually burn through our resources and fuck everything up in the process, but create the illusion of, you know, having power or maintaining a monopoly. Whereas on a Bitcoin standard, you can't fucking do that. Like, you can't create more of it. You can't coercively take it from somebody. It can only, like, Bitcoin only functions if I choose to voluntarily give you some. And that also adds to the shift from, you know, subject overlord to customer and service provider. So, like, you know, I don't know. I guess I'm trying to make the point that by separating money from state, we can actually move towards this kind of a patchwork model. But in the absence of that, I don't think we get there. I actually think we fucking blow ourselves up or create like a, you know, dystopian nightmare where we, you know, end up sending ourselves backwards, you know, 100,000 years in the process. So I feel like, you know, Bitcoin is almost it's humanity's reaction to, you know, all of the democratic, you know, globalist collectivist stupidity that has kind of engulfed everything, and like, you know, Bitcoin has emerged as a counterbalancing force for that. So I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
Well, earlier when you were talking about the Medicis, I was thinking like I'm in complete agreement with you over the idea of like, yeah, you want to have the sovereignty to be in control of the financial resource, but you do want them to be wealthy. That there's a meaningful distinction there. But the idea of exactly like people are very unhappy with the fact that we don't have, you know, beautiful European cathedrals throughout North America, and people kind of, I think, wrongfully attribute this to a loss of religion, and the idea that, well, it's because, you know, if only we had so many people could be united around some central force of spiritual belief, then we could create these beautiful mosques or whatever it is. But the truth is that it's just having highly concentrated wealth and state power that can also look and to invest in something that's going to exist for a few hundred years rather than like a few decades or something. So by kind of empowering the sovereign to, you want them to be as wealthy as possible because that's going to make the state more safe. It also allows them to kind of invest in public goods that we'd consider, you know, like beautiful feats of architecture and design that we haven't seen being built over the past 100, 200 years as frequently because they actually have the ability to control that much resources. Whereas right now, it's like, you know, the Canadian government isn't going to be building any cathedrals anytime soon, and nor would we want them to be because that's completely unrelated to what the average person wants to be seeing. Yeah, I think you could get kind of produce more beautiful outcomes for societies as well, just following through this notion of like, it's having wealth being concentrated isn't actually an issue, and it doesn't prevent other people from becoming wealthy, which is something that people very frequently don't seem to understand.
I really want to touch on that last point there, but I think more than just sovereign being wealthy and, you know, producing, you know, artworks and stuff like that. I think the rise of, you know, I really believe in this idea of like, you know, yes, the prince, but I also believe in the idea of like nobles and lords, and, you know, and I'm just kind of,
what you mean by this, but I'm curious.
okay, I mean like, you know, so let's use, I don't like Elon Musk, so let's use Steve Jobs as like the archetype of like a prince, right? So someone who's like, you know, produced and amassed a ridiculous amount of wealth and produced something of great value. You know, then there might be, you know, like a lord might be someone who's, you know, in the $100 million range, you know, produced an incredible business, you know, and sold that. You know, didn't produce a billion, multi-billion or trillion-dollar business, but still something, you know, extremely profound and powerful. And, you know, he is someone who, you know, owns, it's almost like maybe a county within, you know, the sovereign state. And, you know, you get multiple of these lords, you know, within the sovereign state who kind of help with a fracture or create some sort of accountability within, you know, the borders of, you know, of the sovereign state. And then sort of, you know, I would call, you know, the nobles is, you know, kind of the emerging people. So, you know, I might own 10 McDonald's franchises, or, you know, maybe something a little bit healthier or whatever, but, you know, I own that. So I have some level of, you know, power, influence, and wealth in there. So I guess I'm giving them arbitrary, you know, names, but it's kind of.
Do they wield political power is my question.
Yeah, because I think we're all like political power is in a sense, you know, interrelated, like, because the larger the territory becomes, the more difficult it is to provide services, right? You know, it gets a hell of a lot more complex. And, you know, like as with any business, actually, the more you scale up, the more of a monolith you become, or the more of a behemoth you become. You can't, you know, and this is where I think localism is, you know, an important idea or philosophy, is, you know, this idea that things can only scale up to a certain degree and then they start to fracture and break down again. is that, if a sovereign or a prince wants to run things efficiently, he needs a good fucking management team, and the management team fundamentally, has political influence or has influence, with the sovereign. Now, the sovereign may be the one who makes the final call or whatever, but in a sense, like distributing some of that decision making to counties or sub jurisdictions, I think makes a lot of functional sense. Yeah, what were you gonna say?
Oh, yeah, we're in a we're in a total agreement there. I just wouldn't think to generate a separate title that's for this precise role, but I completely understand what you're saying.
I think, because I guess, there's a point here about, Jordan Peterson seems to have a real misunderstanding of inequality. He always talks about how, Pareto distributions, create problems in society because, we get this inequality of, wealth distribution and stuff. And for me, I try and delineate between static inequality and dynamic inequality. And, in the world we live today, we've got a lot of static inequality. So we've got a fucking class system, right? We have, if you're one of the poors, like if you're broke, destitute, poor or whatever, and, let's say you're born in Africa or a shit country or whatever, you actually can't fucking climb because you don't have the capacity to save. You have a poor currency, you have, fucked up laws, ridiculous government, which taxes, more than you earn or whatever the case is. But you actually stay at the bottom, and it takes an extraordinary amount of, effort and, a good dose of luck to be able to climb out of that bottom cut. And then in the current system, if you're close enough to the top, you don't actually have to provide value. You don't have to do anything of value. You're close enough to the monetary spigot, so you're the first beneficiary of, the money printer. You're the first beneficiary of, like, let's say you're a, one of the FANGs or the FAMGA or whatever in the NASDAQ. Like, as the government produces money, it goes to the central banks, then goes to the investment banks, and then goes all on your fucking balance sheet because they put the money somewhere. And where does it go? It goes into, assets like our 401ks, for example, or in Australia, our superannuation. Like, I think Australia's got the equivalent of the 401k, like superannuation is like one of the largest, pooled funds in the world. And all of that money gets invested in the top 20 companies listed on the Australian Stock Exchange. Mm-hmm. What the fuck, so they get this kind of like flywheel effect, right? So at the moment, if you're at the top of the strata, you don't have to actually produce or add any more value in society. You just need to build moats to keep you there. And what ends up happening is, the lower middle class, the middle class, and the upper middle class, we pay for the people at the bottom and for the shitheads at the top. But we're all fucking stuck in our, class. Like it's not mobile, so it's a static inequality. And what you end up getting is, because we're static, the resources kind of flow upwards because, the people at the top who have very little skin in the game, they have the capacity to basically privatize gains and socialize losses. They play the game of heads I win, tails you lose. Whereas, on a Bitcoin standard, because you kind of remove that, because I honestly believe that the most important power that any entity in the universe can wield is the mechanism through which we measure human action. So in other words, money. Like that funds force, that funds everything else. So you kind of, you throw that out and you kind of put it out of the reach of man. Like, you make it a deity. Like you separate it out, separate it from state, from everything. You actually get what I call like this kind of like a playing field of dynamic inequality. So we'll still have classes. We'll still have poor people, broke, young people. Young people are fucking don't have any money, right? And but they when they trade their labor, their time, their effort, they actually trade it for the same monetary unit that anybody who is at the top actually trades it for. So they have the capacity to actually climb. So you've got this, you have classes, but the classes are permeable because we're all on the same global standard. And simultaneously, like the people at the bottom, they can climb, but the people at the top, they actually can fall. And that is so fucking important because, you know, you might have been intelligent, or you might have just been lucky, or you might have been early to Bitcoin, so you have a shitload. But because you can't create more to keep yourself in that position, or you can't take it coercively from someone, as you know, if you make bad decisions, or if you blow it all on hookers and coke, or if you build a bad business or a shit city or whatever, or you die and your kids are fucking retarded and they blow it all, like you actually come down. And that dynamic inequality is, like, for me, how nature functions. And that gives you an 80-20 distribution. So, you know, yes, 80% of the wealth will probably be held by 20% closer to the top, but they can't stay there through, you know, fraudulent practices. They have to stay there through merit or competence. And that creates a situation in society where, you know, on the way down, you have you know, the corrective, I guess, like economic reality corrects you much quicker on the way down, and economic reality forces you to maintain competence and merit on the way up. And I think where I want to tie this to is, you know, the dynamic inequality that I believe is going to exist, also in this kind of patchwork model of city-states, that poorly run city-states will lose their constituents, and well-run city-states will, you know, gather them. But I don't believe anything can be well run all the fucking time. And the larger it gets, the probably more poorly run it'll become. So as it starts to scale up, it'll naturally reach an equilibrium where, you know, it runs really badly at this scale, and it actually needs to break down into, you know, emergent sub-city states, perhaps, you know, and that's where the idea of nobles and lords in my mind comes up, is that that's people who have amassed enough wealth who can then partition off a section and be part of a, you know, a league or something like that. So anyway, I babbled on for fucking ages just then, but I don't know if you got any thoughts on that.
Well, just what you're saying about like poverty and Bitcoin, like one of the beautiful things about Bitcoin as a system is that even if you're not generating new wealth, the fact that it's a fixed quantity means that so long as other people are, you're still going to increase your purchasing power and get richer just by virtue of the fact that other people are providing things into the system, which is like such an amazing selling point that people seem to constantly like overlook. I don't know, just the fact that deflation is like the most incredible thing in the world, and we don't pay any attention to just how valuable it is.
It's an ETF on human prosperity. That's literally what I call it. Like holding Bitcoin is like holding an ETF on human prosperity. If we get better, if we get more innovative, if we produce more, your purchasing power goes up. It's a fucking incredible thing. So thank you for pointing that out.
Reward saving too, because right now all of the market pressures are like spend your money as quickly as you acquire it, because it's just going down, and try to get it into something that's a little bit more stable. But what you actually want is, you know, you don't want a society that's motivated by consumerism, right? Like if you can have just money sitting in your bank account, in your crypto wallet, and it's just going to passively generate returns for you, that's amazing. That's better than any other system you could imagine.
Yeah. To that point, I wouldn't say passively generate returns. I would say passively appreciating purchasing power. Because I don't think, like, I think a lot of the, you look at all the Ethereum monkeys and everything like that, who are trying to create fucking, you know, these complex, you know, interest bearing things and shit like that, where you actually try and question, so where's the money actually coming from? It's all just one big Ponzi scheme. Whereas like Bitcoin, because it is fixed in supply, and when you fix the money, and you increase human productivity, you actually increase purchasing power, which I think you brilliantly mentioned it in your podcast, where you said like, purchasing power is what counts. So it's like, you know, you can fix the money, but like wealth is unlimited, right? And
Mhm.
so if you fix the money, then you actually incentivize saving. And you know, I always say that saving is like it's genuinely the cornerstone of civilization. Like if a human being cannot save the product of their labor, you cannot build for the future. You cannot lower, you know, future uncertainty. You cannot lower your time preference. It's the biggest cancer in the world today, and that's why, like, you know, Bitcoiners are so, like, I guess, passionate. Is like, fix the money, fix the world is kind of like one of our memes, and it sounds trite, but it's like it's so important
Some people
because if you
not
sort of
understanding the role that money plays in the systems that they exist inside of. Yeah.
yeah, 100%, 100%. So you mentioned something earlier about, like, you know, people sitting on savings doesn't inhibit others from creating their own wealth. Can you please, like, talk to this point just a little bit, because this one drives me fucking crazy. Is like, you know, people like wanting to take down billionaires because they've got it in their fucking bank account. It's like, so what? Go and work yourself, you loser. So, like, can you please talk me through this?
Yeah, well, and it's you can get even a little bit more juicy of that in terms of people conceptualize the notion of somebody else having money, meaning that they have taken something out of the system that's preventing other people from accessing it. But and that would apply if we lived in a tribal society where you used clamshells or something to trade with. Because then if one guy gets a bunch of clamshells and goes away, then you can't trade anymore because you can't break the clamshells in half. But so long as you can keep subdividing the currency, then it being used, all money is a measure of information. And so long as you can keep breaking it apart, then you can continue to spread the information, and it's not preventing any growth from occurring. So what gets even more bizarre is when people get all mad at Jeff Bezos for having all this money. It's not like it's just sitting in his bank; it's operating in other assets. It's not like he's just has a pile. I mean, I'm sure he has some pile of money to sleep on, but it's not the whole billions or trillions of dollars or whatever it is. Um,
Yep.
but by contributing to the system and then not spending it and saving it, you're actually kind of being doubly charitable in a weird sort of way, because you're providing value, and then instead of taking that value and cashing it out and going and getting a smoothie or something, you're just keeping it, meaning other people can go and get smoothies if they want, which is like a tangible resource, which is going to be then more or less depleted, but you're just keeping money at home, which isn't preventing anyone from doing anything. So it's weirdly charitable. You can kind of invert it and then realize that if you go and make billions of dollars and live in a modest condo and don't spend any of it, you've just made the rest of the world much more wealthy while not taking anything in exchange. You could be like sitting on a gold throne or something, but you're not, and you're just letting that value go out into the world.
Yes, and that point, I guess, you know, the Bitcoiner in me wants to, like, throw in again is like, it's more functional, or it's only properly functional with the money that is fixed in supply. So it's like when you
Mhm.
do that, like on a Bitcoin standard, that's actually meaningful. I think where people, and this is where people sort of, you know, they conflate money, they conflate wealth, they conflate fucking, you know, all sorts of things. But um in today's world, you know, there is, because Jeff Bezos, by virtue of having built an incredible business, and actually adding value, and then, you know, by virtue of the system then being so skewed towards, you know, all of the new fake money kind of coalescing around, you know, a few companies, you know, he's been the beneficiary of the broken system. So it's not technically, it's not his fault. And any rational actor in this system would have positioned themselves in a similar place, right? It's that, you know, people point at the wrong part of the problem. So, you know, like, he actually produced something of extraordinary value, and you know, people like that will exist, I think, on a Bitcoin standard in the future. But the beauty there is that they, I think, what one of the big things that people are not anticipating is the because an Amazon or a Twitter or a Google or a Facebook or an Apple or whatever won't, I mean, they'll still probably get like, you know, excessive amounts of capital because like, you know, the structure of markets is such that you want to chase winners, right? So you know, you still will get extra capital, but what we remove is all of the fake capital, because like, you know, I use Twitter as an example, or even YouTube as an example. They actually don't really need to make money as businesses, because they can just keep raising public capital, and they can still keep being beneficiaries of the current fiat system. So what you get is you get this sort of situation. I'm trying to write an article, and one day I've got to finish this, but it's called like The Rise of the Technocratic Leviathans. And I say that because there's a monopoly on money, you know, and that's sort of given a monopoly on large scale states. Now what you've ended up having is sort of the rise of these, you know, oligopoly or monopoly type, you know, technology companies, that have an unnatural amount of resources because of the way, you know, the resource through which we measure human action filters through, right? Like the money filters to them first and it comes to everybody else last. And it just creates a system that is actually unfair, right? And it gives us, yeah, like I said, like unnatural inequality. Like, whereas when you remove that element of it, like you can actually build, let's say, a competitor to Google or Twitter or Facebook or Amazon or whatever, and you can actually compete with them, because what will drive income is actually value, and solving a problem. Whereas if you get to the point like, you know, where you're a Goldman Sachs, they don't actually solve any more fucking problems. Like they're just close enough to the money printer that they can just stay there. You know what I mean?
Yeah. That's, it kind of has to do with like complexity will generate feedback loops, but then you can have maladaptive feedback loops that are continuing to perpetuate throughout the system, which is why it's advantageous to be able to understand how those mechanisms work, so you can step back and then kind of re-examine. Like a cute example of this is like the QWERTY keyboard is a less effective typing setup than whatever I can't remember, Dvorak I think is the alternative, which if you learn to type on that, you'll type way more quickly and efficiently. And the QWERTY is like a legacy from typewriters when they'd get jammed too easily. But now as a society, we're all using something which is more inefficient because it's like the sunk cost of changing it feels too hard to overcome or something, even though, well, we'd all be much faster typers if we were able to kind of step outside of this feedback loop that we put ourselves into. But that instigating that switch is difficult, whether it's money or something more silly.
Yes. So what's your point in that sense, though?
Just that you can have feedback loops that are perpetuating ineffective systems that arise out of complex orientations, but they are no longer beneficial. And so it's advantageous to have some be able to kind of step back and recognize where and when that's occurring and course correct, because otherwise you won't think about the fact that you have all these sort of inefficiencies that even though they should be getting weeded out, they can actually stick around for longer than they need to.
And could I add in there the point about like how, you know, natural competition is the way that these things sort of get weeded out? Like, because they can't get weeded out if, like, you know, if you don't have competition or if you can stamp out competition.
Yeah, of course.
Right. Yeah. I think that's probably something else we've sort of seen in the last 18 months. Like, I guess another reason why people are angry at Jeff Bezos is that, you know, he's benefited from moronic government regulations around, you know, stay home and don't go to the shop because like the corner shop, the small business owner must shut down, but, you know, Amazon can operate because, you know, like, so that's it. Like the state just seems to like literally make fucking everything worse. And it's like, it's not Amazon's fault. Like it is genuinely fucking morons in the government who like literally the buffoons who just make arbitrary decisions for everybody. Like I was in Miami for the last couple of weeks and it was fantastic. Like people were free, everyone was running around, like, enjoying themselves and all this sort of stuff. Um, like living like normal human beings, and then just sort of contrasting that with coming back to Mexico and just like people freaking out and like I swear to God, like wearing masks while they're training in the gym. Like it just sort of reminds me of like
You guys go to the gym. At
how,
least there's that.
yeah. So do you guys still have all your gyms shut? Do you?
Mhm. Yeah, the rules here are just preposterous. They make absolutely no sense,
Yeah.
which is kind
Well,
of, I
that's
think, beneficial long term in terms of revealing government incompetence in all sorts of areas.
well, that's right. So I guess the silver lining in all of this stupidity is that there's a whole lot of short-term pain, but it's the longer-term ramifications of it is they're basically digging their own grave.
Mhm.
But it's a perfect example of like, yeah, almost like arbitrary rules created by moron rulers, that have no basis in like first principles or anything like that. But anyway, that's a that's a much that's another rabbit hole. So we've talked about philosophy, talked about Pareto distribution, determinism and liberty, free will, anarchism, royalism, uh, citadels, scale. We spoke a little bit about money and Bitcoin. Is there anything else you would like to cover? This has been a
Ooh,
fantastic conversation, by the way.
yeah, I've really enjoyed myself. I don't think there is. I've got one more episode of Wonderland coming out, which will be out by the end of
Okay.
the month, and that one's about contracts and commerce. And I'm doing a big piece talking about intellectual property laws, so like copyright and
Mm-hmm.
patents, and why I am philosophically opposed to them. So that I
Okay.
may
Awesome.
tease that a little bit.
Do you want to do a couple minutes on that now? Like,
Sure. Um, yeah, they're no good. It's
all
trying to
right, done.
enter monopoly, yeah, case closed. I think it's another, similar to kind of how I conceptualize land ownership. To me, it seems like some a legacy principle that doesn't actually work in the way that we think it does, and it creates more problems than solutions. And lots of the time, when people are faulting capitalism for creating what they perceive to be inequalities and generating fake monopoly power, actually that's a product of or lots of the time it's the product of IP laws, which I think are totally illegitimate. And so in my formulation of, if you were to like blank slate, do a new state on a piece of paper, I say get rid of those, because you're going to be incentivizing a lot more competition and progress if you do without them. And in terms of incentivizing for like new creations and artists and stuff like that, I think there's other ways people can make money and profit that isn't dependent upon having a monopoly on an idea, essentially, which I don't think is sensical.
Yeah, I agree with that. So a long time ago, I mean, a long time ago, like a couple of years ago, I was still kind of in the camp of like IP makes sense. Although I always had a position of execution matters more than the idea. So like, and that just sort of being an entrepreneur myself, like the amount of times I've like run a business and like one of the first questions I always get from idiot investors is like, oh, do you have a patent on that? I'm like, no, like even if we had a fucking patent, like doesn't matter. Like we don't have hundreds of millions of dollars to protect the patent anyway. So it's like that kind of is a moot point in the first place. So I've always kind of had the predisposition as an entrepreneur. It's like that execution matters more than the idea. But yeah, like there was a really good Twitter thread that I saw like a month or two ago from a guy who like broke down the IP thing, which I thought was really great. But I also got exposed to Stefan Kinsella's work, and he's sort of like the number one like IP guy who's like been against the whole IP law position for for God knows how long now, and he kind of opened my eyes to it, and I think one of the central points that got me over the line is like you know to have private property ownership over something, like first and foremost it kind of needs to be scarce, like, and an idea can't be scarce, right? Like
Mhm.
you and I can have an idea and we can have the same fucking idea. So you can't really protect that. So it's like just the foundation of IP is like sort of falls apart there. And then yeah, the like you kind of said, like the ramifications then that it has on competition and all sorts of other things just creates like fucking Frankenstein outcomes for the whole thing.
Really bad outcomes in terms of, pharmaceutical companies not producing valuable medicine for people who need it because, well, there's an economic incentive to do otherwise and nobody can do anything about it. It's completely absurd. Which is also kind of interesting in terms of conceptualizing if you're interested in the future of, well, new sorts of nations and charter cities and all the rest of it. Currently, kind of part of the problem with IP law is that in order to participate in global trade, that's kind of like a prerequisite, I think. And so that's really, it's forced it upon countries that otherwise maybe wouldn't benefit from it or wouldn't agree to it. It's like, well, okay, but we have to protect Mickey Mouse over here if we want to be able to trade with the big boys. So, okay, fine, we'll do it. And that I guess just begs interesting questions in terms of if you're interested in the formation of new states, how are you going to kind of reconcile those two different things? Because there's always going to be an incentive for monopolists who want patent protections and stuff like that to flock towards systems where those exist. So then the question is, do the benefits of abolishing IP outweigh the costs of not having those producers?
Yeah, well, I think the thing is, again, it comes down to like scale and timeline, right? So on a long enough timeline, it does. But in the short term, I actually think this is one of the hardest things for humans to do is like to actually like be patient and not try and like press the fucking button every 5 minutes, like when something doesn't seem to be working in the short term, because a lot of things that actually are beneficial and beneficial long term and sustainable actually require some sort of like short-term sacrifice and pain, and that requires the patients to sort of sit through it. So like to your point is, maybe in the short term, you lose the producer, but in the long term you can actually outcompete them because you have more competition. So it's like, can you sit through that period of not having them around, and that like genuinely requires like leaders with courage, which ties back into the notion of a prince who has some sort of strong jurisdiction and skin in the game for his
and a set of intelligible
within his
principles,
sovereign borders.
because I think people are raised with an assumption that this is a public good and that there has to be important reasons for it, and then you never really question it. So I'm just very interested in kind of planting the seeds of doubt in terms of lots of things that we've come to accept as being necessary for some reason. Well, is that actually the case, or are we just being born into structures where that's the norm that's being perpetuated? Again, going back to that question of IP laws beget IP laws, you end up in this feedback loop situation, which is creating net losses for people, until at some point you can have somebody wander away and try something out a little bit different. And then I'm pretty confident that that would produce better outcomes long term.
I 100% agree. Okay, I'm going to quickly mention 5 people that you mentioned in the last podcast, because I got them listed here, that were influences for you. Unless you remember them. Do you remember them off the top of your head?
You asked me for 5 thinkers that inspired me.
Yes.
And I think I told you Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, Ayn Rand, Curtis Yarvin, Taleb? I don't know.
It was Douglas Hofstadter.
Douglas Hofstadter. Oh yeah, Douglas Hofstadter is maybe better than Taleb.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool. You should. I remember emailing you afterwards. You would love a copy of Gödel Escher Bach.
Yeah. I will. I mean, Curtis Yarvin is Mencius Mollberg, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah. So, and then he also calls himself John Law somewhere else, right?
Yeah. I sent you some where he was discussing like Bitcoin before it existed. He was talking about it conceptually, and that's what he wrote under.
So I've got to get through that first, and I'm going to go through Douglas. I mean, Taleb I used to fucking love, but I feel like someone ghostwrited his work, because like he's proven to be the biggest fucking moron on the planet in like the last 6 to 12 months. I can't believe it. Like he was actually speaking at a BSV conference. like with the greatest fraud in the history of like the whole Bitcoin space. He just fucking, you know,
I was on a panel with Naval because I saw
no,
the
no,
two
no,
of
no,
them
no,
chatting and it was kind of wholesome because it's just
no.
like
This is just
fun
literally
element.
2 weeks ago. He was
Yeah,
on.
that's what I
He
mean.
decided. Was Naval Ravikant there as well?
I don't know. I saw some lecture that just got posted, but it's the two of them on stage. I thought it was at that conference, and
No,
they're
no, no, no,
talking.
no.
Okay, I'll
No,
send it.
that.
Funny now.
I'm not sure if that's a new one though, because there was an old one with Naval and Taleb, which I watched like a couple years ago, which I thought was pretty good.
There's just a line in it where Naval is saying like, yeah, like this technology is taking a lot of your principles and applying them, and he's like, he's just like not happy about it, but it's so cute somehow. Like, oh, you don't quite understand. I don't know where the like miscommunication is occurring, but it's pretty funny.
I don't know. I feel like because he didn't create it, he's fucking pissed off, or something. But it's just so sad to see him like become the intellectual yet idiot that he warned us of. Like he's become the villain that he pointed to, like
Mhm.
in his books. I swear to God, it's wild. Like, because I mean, the Bitcoin space genuinely like, was inspired by a lot of his work, like everything that he discusses in his books. And it's like, the idea of like, Bitcoin necessitates skin in the game, like, because, as a holder of the thing, you not only want to, protect the network, but you actually enforce the rules of the network, as a node operator in whatever capacity. So it's like, it's got skin in the game. It's an anti-fragile system which evolves and adapts as it fucking grows. Like it's all of these things. And then he goes and speaks at a fucking BSV conference with Craig the fraud Wright, like the guy who like has been caught like literally fraudulently saying that he's Satoshi 100 times.
This
And
guy.
like it's wild. Like, and that sort of obviously contradicts his point, which is if you see a fraud and you don't say fraud, you are a fraud. So he goes and he speaks at the frauds conference. Fucking weird, man. It's so strange. But anyway, yeah,
Ego, it
I
seems
would.
like to a detrimental degree.
Yeah, it is. So I would have checked Taleb in that list too, but I feel like it's Taleb's ghostwriter that should
Yeah,
be in
okay,
that list.
Hofstadter is a much better. He does all the things with complexity and emergence and consciousness that are so interesting,
Hmm.
but slightly less. And actually, he's very mathematic as well. I'll take that back.
Hmm. 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 Awesome. Where can people find your work? Because they definitely need to be listening up.
My name's Jane Gatsby, and my podcast is called Wonderland, and it's on YouTube and all podcasting platforms. And I've got a Twitter and an Instagram that I'm pretty active on. And that's that.
What was the username on Twitter and Instagram? Is it the same?
Jane Gatsby, yeah, on Instagram, and then on Twitter, there's an underscore between Jane and Gatsby.
Okay, cool. So at Jane Gatsby and Jane Gatsby. Have you ever thought about like just matching them, or do you just like the fact that you got Jane Gatsby on Instagram and now you want to keep it?
Oh, like put the underscore there too. No, I mean, I'd like to have it not on Twitter, but it is what it is.
It's a bummer. Yeah, yeah. Cool. Well, Jane, thank you so much. Really enjoyed this one. I'm glad we actually re-recorded because like the first one was good, but yeah, the fucking audio was a disaster, and I feel like this was a much more wholesome conversation anyway.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you.